Hello, dear viewers of the first ever virtual Verbier Art Summit. I am Anneliek Sijbrandij and I'm the founder and director of the Verbier Art Summit. First of all, I would like to welcome you to our summit platform and thank you for being part of the summit's ongoing mission to drive social change. I will introduce three incredible Summit Museum partners that are here with us today and give you some background as to why they are brought together for this opening of the Verbier Art Summit debate series. As you may know, the fourth summit took place in January 2020 around a theme chosen by Jessica Morgan of the Dia Art Foundation in New York, Resource Hungry, our cultured landscape and its ecological impacts. The day after this summit, Jessica and I had a meeting with one of today's guests, Philip Tinari, the director of the UCCA Center for Contemporary Art Beijing, UCCA June, and soon to be UCCA Shanghai, to discuss possible ideas for what would be the summit's 5th anniversary in 2021. Each year, our non-profit platform brings together innovative thinkers with influential artists to kick off debates on important social issues. We started with Beatrix Ruf, our second guest of today, who was the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam at that time and who co-designed the summit format with us back in 2017, themed around growth or degrowth. Beatrix proposed for each Verbier Art Summit to be curated by a new leading museum director, who could identify a theme of their focus for the summit conference and its accompanying book that is designed by Birnbaum each year. For 2018, she proposed our final guest of this debate, Daniel Birnbaum, who is the director of Moderna Museet in Stockholm and is now director of the London-based digital art platform Acute Art. Daniel curated the second summit, around art in the digital age, and he then chose Jochem Volt of Pinacoteca de Sao Paulo to curate a political theme for the 2019 summit, who in turn invited Jessica Morgan to curate the 2020 summit. This brings us back to January 2020, the end of the last summit, when Phil was already dealing with what later turned out to be the COVID-19 outbreak. Phil and I decided together very early on that there would be no big new 2021 summit with a new theme and a new group of international artists and thinkers to come to Switzerland, but that we would focus on continuing the resource-hungry discussion and that we would invite Swiss speakers only, who could hopefully come and travel to Verbier. However, Beatrix, who remains an important partner of the summit as our strategic advisor, urged me that you simply cannot do a Swiss summit if you're an international platform. And of course, she was right. So here we are. We organized 2 new Swiss talks and 1 debate from Verbier, but also 1 international talk and 4 international debates with former and new summit speakers coming from New York, LA, London, Lausanne, Brussels, Sao Paulo, Cuiabá, Rome, Montana, Oxford, Amsterdam, Stockholm, and Beijing. Or I actually think Phil may be in Shanghai right now. A new way forward. That is the hopeful message that came out of the 2020 summit. New ways of looking at the world, new ways of listening, and new ways of understanding. COVID-19 has had a terrible impact on our global society, and it's horrible that most of us are still suffering from the virus at this very moment. But the only upside is that we finally realized that we're all connected as humans, and that this will become a time of great change. Art can enable such a transformation and offer different perspectives on our resource-hungry age. Beatrix, I know you've been thinking a lot about reassessing spaces, structures, and systems of culture to find new ways to operate, and have recently launched a new art fund in the Netherlands that will acquire works for the Dutch state, distributing them amongst Dutch art museums every year. Can you tell us a bit more about this project with the Hartwig Art Foundation and other projects that you've been currently involved with?
That fund is actually a really interesting development. You mentioned the Hartwig Art Foundation is a new foundation founded in 2022. The foundation has other legs, so to say, for that. One is in the medical science and one is in education. And with the Hartwig Art Leg Foundation, the idea is actually to initiate and then sustainably support projects, structural initiatives, systemic initiatives in the arts. And this fund you just mentioned is basically one of the first projects. It can be, that this foundation actually initiates a lot of different projects, and they all can be, but not necessarily have to be institutional in the end. This fund was initiated because on one hand, the question was how to, how to support artists. And the other question was, what does it mean actually to collect art? And with arts means totally all disciplines are meant in there. So for the 2020-21 project, the foundation thought it should be a bit different. It should not act as it will act in the future, in the hopefully very long future, which is to enable artists to produce works they want to produce, and then acquire those works and immediately donate them to the state collection of the Netherlands, which has a long tradition in the Netherlands, actually, that institutions are looking at their collections as something which is beyond the physical place of one institution. And this foundation thought that it would be great to actually fuel into this idea of the state collection in enabling artists to produce work and then make this available actually to all the institutions in the Netherlands, but could also be international institutions through the collection of the state. 2020, we thought it would be much better to look into the fabric of production in the Netherlands. And as you all know, the Netherlands has a really active and important field of post-academic institutions for artists as well as for curators. And many mid and small size institutions which look into early presentations with artists, look a lot into production as well. And this very important fabric, of course, is very endangered in times like we are in now. And we thought that we basically give the whole annual budget of this fund over to those institutions and initiatives in the Netherlands. So we invited the post-academic institutions to propose, to nominate artists from the alumni field. We invited the curatorial post-academic programs to form a team from their alumni. And this team of 5 young curators is now really handling the project. So 15 artists now get immediate honoraries, and there's a budget to acquire the work. They're not commissioned work, but they're actually just being supported to continue the work as they want to. And mid of this year, we will know which works will go into the Rijkscollectie. And then there is a group of 5 institutions which then will do shows with the artists and their works. That brings me to the other institution I'm involved in, is the Garage Museum in Moscow. And that was actually very interesting because since, it's almost a year now that I haven't been able to go there physically.
Wow.
Everything has happened on Zoom. And in a way, it really intensified also many things, particular discussions about values of the institution, strategic developments that are in planning or will be addressed soon. What does it mean to keep a program alive when artists cannot travel to the spaces anymore, to the places anymore? What does it mean to act as an international institution if you cannot have physical exchange internationally anymore? And I think the Garage did some really incredible things also. They immediately set up a a program to support local artists. So they commissioned work actually to many Russian artists, and these works will be shown this year. They also set up a canteen and provided food to not only the many people working at Garage-Nan being forced to work from home, but also to artists and people in need in Moscow, like a really huge project, I think, and a really important project. And I have to say the thinking about and thinking with institutions in distance is a very interesting exercise, so to say, when you're forced to think beyond the structural behavior you usually apply to the institution. And I'm very happy how particularly projects in developing new buildings, but also developing new programs in terms of support of artists locally, but also globally. Yeah, really made a lot of differences possible in that restrictions we had to work with. So, for example, they totally revamped their residency program, and it's actually more international now than it was before. And yeah, and the question of what it means to act local, but think about the planet at the same time is one of the, I think, one of the themes that will be our permanent friends for the future. Yeah, I think one of the things we all have experienced with this particular situation we are in is that the problem is also the chance, so to say. This is the first time I think we experience that something has global meaning and planetary meaning, and that this COVID thing cannot be solved in thinking national or local only, because it is addressing the whole world.
Exactly. I think also, Phil, you said it very beautifully that now, for example, the artist cannot travel to China, but the art is still traveling to your museum.
No, it's true, and it's actually led to some really poetic moments. Over the summer, we opened an exhibition with Elizabeth Peyton that had been postponed, like so many exhibitions, because of the pandemic. But it came to, we were working with the National Portrait Gallery in London, and in a normal time, a show like this would mean, Nick Cullinan would come and Elizabeth would come and people from the studio would come and the gallerists would come and we would have a big dinner, and that mode that we were all so used to of kind of how the art world would always work. And we were faced by the beginning of the summer. Of course, there was this staggering of, first China was locked down and then it moved to the rest of the world. And then 2 months later, Europe confronted and the US confronted what we had originally confronted. And so, through these extended conversations with our colleagues in London and with Elizabeth and her colleagues in studio back in New York, we finally decided, that it wasn't going to happen in the normal way, but was that a reason to do nothing at all? Or instead, maybe we should transform our approach. And so the works came. And it meant lots of adjustments because you still have certain things that you need to, responsibilities to fulfill in terms of how you take care of art, conditioning and all the registrarial and conservatorial stuff that goes into any exhibition. And as so many artists have learned this year, you figure out how to oversee an installation through Zoom and other media of digital communication. But I think in the end, what was so poignant about this show was this idea at the opening. These works were somehow like messages from another reality, which of course in an encyclopedic museum or a historical museum, that's the works of art are messages from another time and another place. But to have that experience in this contemporary context was something totally new. The idea that Elizabeth couldn't be there and we couldn't, other people couldn't convene in person, but somehow the artworks, had this power to cross borders that we have temporarily been denied. So that was, I think for me, it was this really poetic realization of kind of why we do all this, right? I mean, for so many of our viewers, the average viewer, let's say, many people, that's kind of what it always was, right? Or what it always is. But I think it sort of recentered us and recentered the conversation on the power of artwork itself to elicit different kinds of responses and affects.
Super. Okay, so I think we'll go to Daniel. Our virtual platform here at the summit has a section with art and ecological inspiration, where people can find the free Acute Art app, through which they can discover AR artworks within the comfort of their home. You have worked with major artists, including Olafur Eliasson, who you also brought to the 2018 summit, and with whom you created first the VR Rainbow and more recently Wunderkammer, which is an augmented reality collection of natural elements, small artworks and experiments from the artist studio. AR at your home is obviously a very eco-friendly way of experiencing art, whereas Olafur is also always making work that raises our consciousness about the environment. Do you see that there's a connection between these artists that take up new technologies, also being more ecologically engaged?
The quick answer will be yes, but there are many things to say about this, of course. I mean, maybe first a little reminder that things happening in the digital sphere aren't necessarily totally harmless from a kind of ecology point of view. It's all, to do with the big server parks, somewhere where we normal people never go. And, the whole internet is powered and, so, and we're far away from a kind of green net yet and so on. But so that's just a little, a remark that, but I'm of course fully with you here and I understand your question. And I would say that compared to shipping major artworks across the ocean in crates and flying there to see artworks and, them flying back home and, all the way the art world has operated normally over the last decades, at least, with the, the art fair and Biennale models, that is ecologically disastrous. And of course, I see these new technical possibilities as, an answer or part. Some of the artists that we work with are very involved in ecological questions and political questions, and Acute Art is it's a laboratory or it's a kind of studio basically, exploring new technical possibilities, and in every century there seems to be the introduction of one or two new important visual mediums. I mean, think back in the 19th century, we had photography, and that confused everyone, and people wondered what photography would be in the future and whether it would kill painting. And we know that all confusion. But there's always an interesting period also, a few years or maybe longer of confusion maybe, but also experimentation. And artists often explore these new possibilities in an interesting way when things are relatively new and not yet defined. And I think in this century, we have so far a new medium, or say it's a cluster of possibilities, which is AR and VR and mixed reality. It's all from a technical point of view very very similar, but it can be projected or it can reach an audience via an iPhone or via an iPad or a computer or a headset, and all of these things I think will develop. And when I got involved with this, which is actually, it's nice to be here with all of you, because when was it, in 18? Yep. We had the conference about more than real, I called it. I was asked to kind of formulate the theme, and art in the digital age, and we were looking at some virtual reality pieces there, including Olafer's rather minimal VR piece called Rainbow. And I always thought that these possibilities would become more and more, of interest to people in a few years when the conversation about the climate crisis becomes even more, more radical, and the whole thing would become more urgent. But of course, the COVID situation somehow fast forwarded everything, because suddenly it was no longer, an hypothesis that, in a few years everything has to change. No, it changed. We were all, in lockdown, or at least we couldn't travel, and all the kind of questions that that I thought could be discussed in relationship to these themes were suddenly present, and all the limitations and all the problems, and we had to, react to something immediately. And we did a virtual reality piece with Marina Abramovic a few years ago that was about melting ice, and it was premiered in Stockholm during the Nobel Prize week. And she spoke to scientists and presented this as a kind of visually strong statement about the condition, about our planetary condition, basically. And we did a VR piece, a very rough VR piece with Ai Weiwei, which is also about his key interests, or his themes, that life on the planet. It was about homeless people, migrants, and homeless animals, and that was launched together with the Guardian, the newspaper. And during the first hour, it reached, I think, 25 or maybe more, maybe 50,000 people. And that was possible because it was not in headsets. That's when it was just on screens and on telephones, and one could see it, of course, as a fully immersive experience in a headset. But it could also reach people via the phone, and that's when we started to understand that something we of course already knew, but that VR is a great visual possibility, but it's rather difficult to distribute still, and you need headsets and heavy equipment. And we did a few shows. I did a show called Electric that traveled to some institutions in Germany and the US and so on, but it didn't reach a lot of people. The Ai Weiwei's piece did, but then of course AR is a super easy to distribute. That it can, everyone basically who has a phone which is relatively modern can see these things. It has other challenges. It is not quite as overwhelming, of course, as a virtual reality piece, the most overwhelming of mediums, basically. But it became an interesting possibility in the middle of the lockdown, and we had already produced a number of things, and Olafer, as you said, Anneliek, he continued his exploration of these new mediums with this piece he calls Wunderkammer, which is basically a number of natural phenomena, like the sun and a cloud that rains, and a little bird and a few other things from nature that we would normally have outside, that you could bring inside, and you could place it in your own living room. And yes, in Olafer's case, this is very much part of his general interest in political challenges and ecological challenges, and we launched this, I think, in the late spring, and it immediately really reached large audiences, probably bigger audiences than anything I've ever been involved with, including the Venice Biennale, because it really reaches people everywhere. And then we weren't so sure how we would kind of institutionalize, or whether we wanted to institutionalize this, and what are the art structures, the art world structures that can carry these works. And we did a number of small things in relationship to art fairs and institutions like the Serpentine in London. They're always very interested in these kinds of things. And then the conversation started with Phil, and Phil actually did the first ambitious institutional AR show, I think, in the world. There has been other, I shouldn't pretend that this is not, that Phil and I are alone here, and there are other initiatives, and there are, artists who've done works with their own apps and all of that. But, a major museum like the UCCA placing a number of rather complex AR pieces together in a group show. I think it was a first, and I of course couldn't see it, and officially says I curated it, whatever that means. I guess Phil placed it in different places with some colleagues and friends that we have, common friends in China. So it was an interesting bridge between London. I could hardly leave my apartment. I was always in my kitchen. And there I was, curating in China. That was a bit of a, scientific-like, a science fiction-like kind of experience. And I think it did reach a lot of people. And then, we can maybe listen to Phil how he experienced it, but rather quickly after that, we thought we could do a similar thing. So just a few weeks later, we did something a bit similar in London, but without an institution. We also thought that, super interesting to see how it works in a museum, but also we could explore some sort of festival biennale-like possibility. So together with a magazine called Dazed, or a media group rather, Dazed and Confused, with Dazed, we did a similar show, but outside along the river. Unfortunately, they had to close because, it was up for a few weeks and a lot of people saw it. But then came the third lockdown, and we're not even allowed to go out more than 1 hour. So we thought there's no point in pretending that we have a show there. And that's when the third step came, which you mentioned, Anneliek, where we asked people to curate their own shows in their houses. And this is again a collaboration with Dazed. So they, since they have big audiences actually with several different magazines and different digital platforms, they ask people to put together their own show. It's maybe not fully on the level of a real physical show, but it's a possibility. But I have to say that this year has been a horrible year, but it's been kind of interesting for someone working with these possibilities.
Okay, Phil, I would like to move on to you, please. So you said art has a very powerful way of opening up your eyes. And Jessica Morgan also spoke about this in our New York debate, where she said that at DIA, they center their attention on people rather than things now. And earlier this year, we also discussed this with you, Phil, that the institution now functions more as a caretaker of its staff, its community, its artists, also focusing more on the local rather than always the international. We just touched upon it already a little bit as well. Is this trend continuing now life has pretty much returned to normal in Beijing?
I think absolutely. I think we've just become much more intentional about the way we think about what we do. And part of that is even just maybe doing a little bit less and trying to do it with a bit more care and a bit more planning and time going into it, just because the previous rhythm of just more now, faster, bigger is I think suspended for some period. So just the act of having to postpone so many of the 2020 shows into the future, on the most basic level, gave us for example Taofei, whose retrospective will open in March. It should have opened in September already, and it should be over by now. And it's, in a way, it's just kind of wonderful that there's been an extra year for us to think about all the possibilities and the great responsibility of presenting her work, comprehensively, really, in China for the first time. Here's an artist who's shown all over the world at Serpentine and PS1 and the Pompidou and so on, but has never really properly been put in front of people in the city where she's lived and worked for the last 20 years. And to do that in a way that's also trying to think about more specifically about why the viewer would risk coming and what they might be hoping to get out of the experience of being there, rather than just doing it because for the obvious sort of curatorial and academic reasons that we previously might have. So, and I guess also through this whole time we've been planning to open a new venue in Shanghai, and actually going through the whole construction process and sort of trying to plan moments of rest and places of reflection kind of into the museum kind of from the beginning has been another powerful experience for us as well. So I suppose I think this whole experience has made us just a lot more willing to think about the implications of everything we do, and not just with reference to its environmental impact, but also just its rationale. What kinds of, back to this idea of resource hungry, right? Like what resources are consumed with every single decision, be those the public's attention, our own budgets, or just kind of the sort of labor and time of our staff and our different collaborators.
Thank you for that. Would you want to start explaining a little bit on the show you did together with Daniel recently?
Sure. Well, I mean, the exhibition is called Mirage, Contemporary Art and Augmented Reality. And it actually sort of grew out of a smaller collaboration. There was an idea because of certain friends and collaborators working in and around UCCA to present one or two pieces that Acute had produced. And we actually, a little bit the opposite of what I just said, but we sort of allowed it to grow very intentionally, but allowed it to become kind of bigger as the conversation evolved. And we thought maybe instead of presenting a single work, it's more interesting to really dig a little bit deeper and try to explore what this new medium of augmented reality might mean for the art world and for viewers and consumers of contemporary art, especially against this context of it being more and more difficult to move people and objects across borders. So is there a way you can conceptualize and execute a highly international collaboration, but one that is, obviously not entirely carbon neutral, but one that is still possible even against these new circumstances. And so what we got in the end was, I think, an interesting selection of the experiments that Acute has been doing over this last year or few years with artists as they've begun to make their dreams into realities using this new technology. My deepest impression of the whole thing is that, we've spent so much time thinking about what it means when the museum becomes a place to take photos and selfies. The ironic thing is that with work in AR, you actually can't take a selfie because you have to use the phone to view the art. And actually, because it's such an emergent technology, you kind of have this situation that occurs frequently where you see people, kind of groups of people huddled over a device, sort of trying to figure out how to make something work together, which is probably a temporary dynamic. I mean, I think in a few more updates of the operating system and of the Acute app, and this will probably be built into really basic functions that we access with one click. But there's this kind of liminal moment going on where it kind of reminds us of like the internet in the 90s, when everyone was sort of just first figuring out what are the rules of the game and how does this work. And it's nice because there's a lot of potential and possibility in those kinds of moments. And so I think that's one reason why it was sort of fun to do it at this particular time instead of a year from now or 2 years from now.
We've taken Jessica's 3 questions as kind of guidance for this virtual Verbier Art Summit. And her first question centers around hope. Can we reassess the spaces, habits, structures, and systems of culture to find new ways to operate and new ways to experience? Daniel, back to you, I think. What is your view on this?
Of course, I am thinking about those questions in relationship to these new visual possibilities provided by these new mediums, and what is actually what are the spaces that we inhabit, and what institutional platforms do we need if we think about these how these forms will develop. And in a way, this year has been, has given me and my colleagues a chance to really think about that. And the three examples again are, what we did with Phil and what we did with the City of London, and what we now ask you and everyone who listens to us here to try at home and place those objects. And it's very different from the traditional museum world that I worked in for 20 years or so. I mean, the museums in London were totally closed. The museum where I used to work, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, is still closed. A year ago, or a little bit more than a year ago, I remember we were working with Olafur to, talk about one of our favorite examples here, since he's been involved with this summit also. He had his biggest, maybe, or one of his biggest shows in London at the Tate, where he once became so visible. When was that? Almost 20 years ago or 18 years ago,
yeah.
something, when he showed his big sun, the weather project. But now he had a more traditional, or a real survey. At the opening, I had nothing to do with the show, but I went to the opening and listened to some of the talks, and that was the moment when Tate Modern announced their climate emergency. Yeah, and I think that's very seriously meant. And they will try to change things. And this was before COVID, when they had to change everything. But it still remains a bit of not a mystery, but what Phil was talking about, that every decision has to be thought through. If you think about institutional ways of operating, for a big museum that is actually built on massive audiences, and it's built for massive audiences, and it is dependent on tourism and on cheap flights, and they have 8 million visitors or something. The museum, what will this climate emergency actually imply beyond doing less? Or is it simply that to do less? But less of all the things that made the place significant and popular in the first place. I'm not sarcastic now. It's just that doing less of that which you're good at or something. Protect me from what I want, you have to tell the blockbuster museum. But we will see. It's interesting how this will develop now. Certain museums are more, maybe it's easier for a relatively small place to adjust and work in a different way, and it's not built on big collections and works being shipped. And a major blockbuster show often is the most horrible example from a climate perspective, where you ship the star loans, the best pieces have to come from other continents and all of that. And maybe it's, one has to think about how things are shipped, and all decisions have to be rethought, I guess. And these are just questions. I don't really have answers. One of the answers is, of course, a little bit to do with what Beatrix is involved with in Holland. Actually in Sweden right now, when everything is closed, and the Moderna Museet is a state museum where I used to be the director. Was never very rich, but privileged in many ways, because we could do most things. It was very stable, but we never had enormous amounts of money or anything. But suddenly the state gave the museum, I think, 3 million euros to buy local art, to buy Swedish art. I don't know if this is the right thing to do, but they did, and it's great for the museum, and it's great for the local art world, and for all the, not to mention the local galleries, because it's an emphasis on new forms of localism, and maybe this is one of the effects will be a new insistence on grassroots kind of initiatives, and I have nothing against all of that. I think it's all wonderful to be local and all of this, but be local, and what did Beatrix say? Think about the planet. That's I'm also a believer in international discourse. And in things that we don't have to fly to Hong Kong or Miami every weekend. That's not necessary, but I do think that, you know, the international conversation is important. It's one of the things that made the art world very, very interesting. And new localisms should not lead to new nationalisms and kind of a stubborn insistence only on, you know, on new kind of local identities or something. So that's a challenge, maybe. Well, as you hear, I have no answer. I only have questions.
Beatrix, I think we discussed this actually at the first summit in 2017 already, no?
Yeah, we did. But I think, may I ask, Daniel? Yes, to talk about the local fabric or the national fabric in this case, actually in a way meant to enable it to stay international, because most of the artists in that year's program now, and all of the curators are actually not Dutch. Mm-hmm. They are part of that international fabric the country is made of, you know. Yeah. So in a way, a local. I really and feel we have spoken about that, you know, in June already or something, no? That actually one of the big challenges will be, you know, to not get a wrong idea about local, and what I mean, again, this pandemic made so clear that we cannot think not connected planetary anymore. Mm-hmm. You cannot. I mean, that was one of the things I thought was really sad. You know, when the first national borders closed down, that was actually a chance in Europe to think in a different way. It has been then thought further in the second lockdown versions, but to close down national borders is one of the big, not only a physical problem but also a mental problem, I think.
When we had the New York debate, we had Alison Tikel, the founder of the London charity, who works a lot also with Tate, for example, on this climate emergency. And she said the climate crisis is actually a cultural crisis. So we've seen now with COVID that we can all come together to resolve these issues. And it's the same with the climate. If we all work together, there's an opportunity to solve that issue as well. And we really hope that because people have seen now through COVID, as you say, Beatrix, how connected we are, and that you can work together to resolve it, that will happen on the climate front as well.
First, I saw Bruno Latour, the philosopher, and Noam Chomsky claiming this early on, you know, after a few weeks of COVID. And then it actually, you know, was repeated by both Macron and Merkel. So it actually reached the highest level of European politics that this is, you know, a test. This is a dress rehearsal, so to say, for things that have to be developed over the next couple of years. And also a moment when the nations put enormous budgets into programs, they should also insist on change.
Exactly.
And I guess that is happening, I think.
Do you see that happening in China as well, Phil?
Maybe not in exactly the same way. I mean, the situation here is, you know, is so different. The state is involved in a completely other kind of way, right? As a sort of presence that's sort of everywhere, but hopefully not super directly involved in your programming or in your funding even. And yet, I do think there have been, you know, changes to behaviors that have become ingrained actually fairly quickly. And I think for China, a lot of it has just been about this realization of its kind of enhanced place in this global conversation. You know, I mean, this is the place where the pandemic originated. As much as people speak about that in different ways, I think there is this baseline consciousness that this is a, you know, an issue that began here. And then of course you have this sort of idea of looking at the world and seeing different ways of managing it, and a kind of, it's been reported on a lot, but a certain confidence that comes with looking at how, the successes of this Chinese response. But I mean, I think more than that, it's, and on the level not of, government organs, but of just kind of ordinary thinking people, this kind of marks this moment where China is no longer peripheral. It's somehow very central to where things are going, and the kind of responsibility that comes with and from that is certainly something I get from conversations I have with my staff and with other kind of interlocutors here.
I thought it was interesting that the first reflexes were to reduce. Everyone was speaking about reduction of travels, reduction of programs, reduction. But I hope that actually what Daniel also touched on, that is this dress rehearsal really leads to investment in changes, structural changes, not only in terms of the tools we use like planes and ships and whatever, but also in terms of societal structural development. And yeah, let's hope that there's a lot that can be learned from the situation we are in now.
Great. Daniel, any final comments?
The question of what art's role could be in all of this, because we're talking about enormous structural issues, and maybe it's a romantic idea that art somehow shows the way or anticipates things, or can be prophetic in some way, that it shows new ways of thinking or new ways of acting. And well, I'm maybe not a believer in the most let's say romantic version of that, but it is interesting how artists sometimes can represent what John Cage called an early alarm system, or where things become visible. And Phil and I did a conversation about our little experiment, it was published by one of the digital art magazines, ArtNet, and I was thinking of an example of, there are many examples of that. People have said that Borges wrote short stories that were actually anticipating hypertext. So it's he was exploring digital realms before they existed. And Emily Bronte wrote Wuthering Heights, which is the novel, which is written almost like a film script. And there are many such examples of things one cannot prove, but that would kind of indicate that artists are actually already exploring future mediums, things that don't really fully exist yet. And I once did a show with Kraftwerk. I knew Ralph Hütter a little bit. Florian Schneider is now dead, unfortunately, but the two of them had they wrote this little, or there's a book written about them rather, and it opens with this dream sequence. And that's something, I mentioned in this conversation that I had with Phil, that they were dreaming of, a future global art form where, they could be on their bicycles and they would trigger concerts all over the world simultaneously with, robots playing their music everywhere. And this, of course, has come true, but it's a much more, it's easier now with the AR than with pre-programmed automatons. But it's interesting to think about how maybe artists can, if they're good examples. This is maybe a good theme for a future summit. Where do we find examples of art actually not just claiming to be or be of political relevance and representing an early alarm system, and where are real examples of that? I think the Kraftwerk example is just an example, but I'm sure we could all think about it and find other examples.
Phil, could you respond to that?
I mean, it's I guess just to say very simply that it's kind of more urgent than ever to create or to operate or to perpetuate spaces where new kinds of possibilities can find temporary and perhaps permanent homes. And so I think just in terms of like what is the institution and what is its role, to coming back to some of the stuff you were raising at the beginning of this conversation, that will expand. I mean, I've just been reading this great book by Andras Santo, the museum kind of thinker and consultant, with interviews with museum people, 28 people all over the world, kind of talking about the future of the institution. And I think again and again, people are coming back to this idea of the communities that we build, that we operate, and that we are sort of obliged to and grateful to have in our care through all kinds of transformations that seem to be happening very, very quickly.
Great. Well, I think that's a beautiful quote to end this debate on. I would like to thank all three of you very much for joining this discussion. And let's now move on to the live Q&A.